This conference will now be recorded.
I'll announce it. 671. Joseph, just let me know that the song after the sermon tonight is going to be number 671, so you can be getting your songbooks marked to that hymn. It's good to be with all of you tonight. What I want to start doing tonight is looking at a new series of lessons. Last year we looked at the armor of God in Ephesians 6, and for I guess 8 months at least out of this year, I want us to be looking at this text in Revelation chapters 2 and 3 primarily, dealing with the 7 churches of Asia. But what we have in the book of Revelation are the final words of God that are recorded for us. What is God's concern in the book of Revelation? I found this quote this last week that I think helps us understand what the book of Revelation is getting at. And let me go ahead and read this quote. It says, "The church today, and particularly the church in America, needs to understand that God has not called his people out of the world simply to wage a culture war with the world. We're not meant to gain temporal ground like some invading force working to superficially turn the country back to God." Now, the point that that author was making is that the mission of the Christian is not to try to change all of the political landscape around us. It's not to try to affect all kind of societal differences in those kinds of ways, but rather the purpose of the Christian is that we get it right personally, and that as local churches, that we get it right, and that we try to seek out to be lights in the world, and that we try to influence people around us one person at a time. And this is what we see in Revelation 2 and 3 with these letters to the churches. These people are living in Asia Minor, where there would have been all kinds of societal problems. And here, embedded in the final words of God that are recorded for us in Scripture, is God saying to these churches that you need to get it right. Not everybody else around you, but you need to get it right. Now, it's felt like to me that over the last few years, there's been an increased interest in the book of Revelation. As there's more and more breaking news, there's people that are wanting to consult the book of Revelation to see if the events in this book are coming to pass in our day and age and things like this. In other words, the book of Revelation has a lot of interest when people are trying to prognosticate about the future. Look at Revelation chapter 1, verse 3, though. In Revelation chapter 1, verse 3, it says, "Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and keep what is written in it, for the time is near." Notice that he says here that you're blessed if you keep or if you obey the things that Revelation teaches. It's not saying that you're blessed if you can connect modern events with the things of Revelation. I think, by the way, the book of Revelation was for a first century audience and had first century meaning. But you're not blessed if you just speculate about the book. You're not blessed if you just do history lessons from the book. But you're blessed if you actually keep what's written in it. And so I want to give you a preview of what we're going to be looking at in this series of lessons. This month, today, we're looking here at what I'm calling the visionary prelude to these 7 churches at the end of chapter 1. Because before you get these letters to the 7 churches to whom John is writing, you've got this vision of Jesus. And that's what we're going to look at tonight, because it introduces, in a lot of ways, these letters. But in February, we'll look at the church at Ephesus. This was the church that famously lost its first love. In March, we'll look at the church at Smyrna, which was heavily persecuted. We'll look at Pergamum and Thyatira in April and May. These are 2 churches that were heavily influenced by false teaching. The church at Sardis in June was a church that had a good reputation, but they were actually dead spiritually. The church in Philadelphia in July, this was one of the good churches that were going through a lot of persecution, just like the church at Smyrna was, and they were committed to doing what God wanted them to do. And then we'll end with Laodicea, which is famously known as being lukewarm. Now, some people have wondered, these 7 churches that we'll be looking at in this series during the year, were these literal churches or were they figurative churches? Because it seems like when you look at these 7 churches, they kind of summarize the problems that churches throughout history might have. I think that these were 7 literal churches that also symbolically are going through the same kinds of things that could be true in generations to come. Now, what I want to do in this lesson, just as we look at this section in chapter 1, is I want to look at chapter 1, verses 9 through 11 to start out with, and we'll just see some overall survey observations from these 7 letters that we're going to be looking at. We'll use verses 9 through 11 to launch into some of those observations, and then we'll conclude the lesson with verses 12 through 20 to actually look at the vision that John sees that introduces these letters. So let's go ahead and start out by reading chapter 1, verses 9 through 11 to get us oriented to this text. Revelation chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet saying, write what you see in a book and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus and to Smyrna and to Pergamum and to Thyatira and to Sardis and to Philadelphia and to Laodicea. Now, we just read a lot of different geographical places, so let me go ahead and put this map up here. You'll see from this map here that John is writing from this island of Patmos here. And this was a rocky island that there wasn't a ton of vegetation on this kind of island, but this was a place that you would go to if you were some kind of criminal. It was a penal colony. And here John has been sent here, and you can see why in verse 9 in our text. He said in verse 9 that he was on this island on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. This means that when John writes this letter, he's shackled behind prison bars, but he's being transported into the heavenly realm. So he's not just confined to this one spot. God can transcend the prison bars and give him these visions that he's going to have in this book. But can you imagine, as John was on this island of Patmos, and if he would have, been able to talk to other prisoners, and John asks somebody, hey, what are you in jail for? And they'd say, well, insurrection or murder or stealing or something like that. And then somebody asks John, what are you in prison for? And he would have to say, well, I was talking about this guy who's actually the real king. It's not Caesar. His name is Jesus. Let me tell you about him. It would have been an interesting conversation, as you might imagine. But John here, he's writing from this island, and notice that he's writing and he's addressing these 7 churches of Asia. He says about these people, and by the way, the closest church to the island of Patmos is Ephesus. What's the first church that's addressed in these 7 letters? The first one is Ephesus. Did you notice the order in which they occur in the text in verses 9 through 11? Ephesus is first, and then it's Smyrna, and then you go to Pergamum, and then Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. The order in which these churches are given are not just kind of random. They actually follow the travel routes that you would have gone, which makes sense with trying to give this letter to other people. But you notice that this audience, John says that he's a partner in tribulation with these people, which means that these churches in modern day Turkey, these churches, these 7 churches, were all experiencing some kind of persecution or difficulty that was hindering perhaps some of their mission as Christians, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But have you ever wondered before if the book of Revelation is just a completely made up kind of fairy tale sort of book? My mom and dad, who don't believe in the Bible, my mom thinks that John was high on mushrooms when he wrote this book, actually. But when you see that he's actually writing from this island that we can identify on a map, And then it's following geographically, even the order in which these places are given. You can see that these are real places and these are churches that were going through real difficulties. Now, you see that in verses 10 and 11, that while John is in this prison, he's taken up in the spirit, which means he's having a spiritual vision kind of experience. And there's this voice that's speaking like a trumpet. And the voice is telling John to write something to these 7 churches, which means that the totality of the book of Revelation is a letter written to these 7 churches, but embedded within the book of Revelation, we have these 7 specific letters that we're going to look at in this series of lessons. What I want to do, just for a brief moment, is explain the structure, not of Revelation as a whole, but these 7 letters that we're going to be looking at in this series. What is the structure of these 7 letters? There's kind of a pattern that these 7 letters follow, and I'll give you loosely what this pattern is just to help prime ourselves for what we're going to be looking at starting next month. In each of these letters, they begin with Jesus saying something like, I know your works, or I know your tribulation, or something to that effect. In other words, Jesus is fully aware of the situation and circumstances of every one of these churches. By the way, the word revelation, the name of the book, it's not Revelation with an S, by the way, it's Revelation singular. The book of Revelation, what does the word revelation mean? It means to unveil something that's not obvious to the naked eye. So every section that you look at in the book of Revelation, it's revealing something that might not otherwise have been obvious to us. And so here Jesus knows what's going on in every church. The second part of the structure to this is that Jesus will praise the churches, and there's 2 exceptions to this. Sardis and Laodicea, they don't have any praise given to them, and we'll see why that happens as we go through these letters. But he praises them for the things that are good, and then he rebukes them, except for Smyrna and Philadelphia, for the things that need to be rebuked. Notice how balanced Jesus is and how he's approaching these churches. If there's good things to say, he'll say that first. And then if there's something to rebuke, he'll say that next. But then fourth, the next thing that these letters will do is there'll be some kind of exhortation. To exhort somebody means that you come alongside them, and if they're hard-hearted, you give them a strong rebuke. And if they're really soft-hearted, you have to kind of grow their soul. So God is adapting to whatever it is that they need. And then as every letter ends, there's some kind of summons to listen. Like when Jesus would say regarding the parables, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. He says something like this in every one of these letters. If you have ears to hear, then hear what the letter means. Now, just as a question for all of us, have you ever analyzed Revelation 2 and 3 and really tried to pay attention to what these letters are saying? He who has ears to hear, listen diligently to what these things are saying. And then the final part of every one of these letters is that there's a promise to people who overcome. So every church, there's some kind of barrier to them fulfilling their work as a local church. And so for every one of them, he's going to say something like, to the one who overcomes, to the ones who fight against these temptations, there's some promise given. Now, we're going to come back to this throughout the series, but I'm going to show you this now, that in every one of these churches, Ephesus through Laodicea, there's a promise given if they will conquer. Like there's the tree of life, you're going to escape the second death, you're going to be given a new name, you're going to be given some kind of authority, the book of life, New Jerusalem, a new name, there's going to be throne. With every promise to these churches, the fulfillment of them are found at the end of the book in chapters 21 and 22, where it talks about the new heavens and the new earth. So embedded within Revelation, it says, this is the promise of you overcome. And the book circles back to that in the final 2 chapters, I think to give added motivation to the original audience to conquer these things that they're told to conquer. So that's the structure that we're going to see as we go through this. Let me bring up one other thing. And some of this is a little bit more technical, but this is the introductory lesson to this. Have you ever noticed any kind of progression or structure to these 7 churches beyond just how each individual letter is structured? Have you noticed how all 7 of these letters, when you look at them as a whole, progress? So here's how they progress. The first church, Ephesus, is an unfaithful one, and the last church, Laodicea, is unfaithful. So you begin and you end with churches that are very unfaithful, and their candlestick is going to be removed from them if they don't repent. But then you've got the second and the second to the last one. Those are both the faithful churches. You've got Smyrna and you've got Philadelphia. Those are the two churches that are both doing very well, and there's not really any rebuke given to those churches. In fact, both of those churches are suffering at the hands of what John calls the synagogue of Satan in Revelation 2:9 and in Revelation 3:9. So these are the two churches that are most heavily being persecuted. Now ask yourself this question. Have you been so committed and devoted to Jesus that you've suffered because of it? That's what these two churches were experiencing. So you begin and end with unfaithful churches. The second and the second to the last are faithful ones. The three middle ones, Pergamum, Thyatira, and Sardis, these are all churches that are partly faithful. You're going to see this as we go through this series, but in these three middle churches, it's going to be emphasized that there's false teaching being tolerated, but there's some of them who haven't soiled their garments. Or there's false teaching that's being tolerated, but some of them have remained faithful. So that's the structure to these seven churches as we go through this. Now, one other thing that I want to observe, just big picture wise, before we look at this vision. And again, we're going to flesh more of this out as we go through this series. But these seven churches were largely impacted by their societies. If there are special temptations in the city of Pergamum, for example, you can find historical records about the nature of the city of Pergamum or about the nature of the city of Laodicea. And we're going to find as we go through this series that one of the major temptations of these Christians, the ones that were struggling at least, was to adopt some of the ways of thinking that their society had wanted them to adopt. Do you think that's a struggle for Christians today? What was the biggest struggle for the Israelites in the Old Testament? God was saying to them, you be holy, for I am holy, you be different from the world. And then all throughout Old Testament history, their problem was that they became just like the world. We have to be careful that we're not following the cultural narratives that everybody wants us to believe in. We have to make sure that we're careful to not just swallow everything that the media wants us to take in, but that we're people who are listening to what God says first and foremost. Now, we'll say more about that as we go through this, but that's just a heads up on some of the things that we'll see. The second thing I want to do in this lesson is I want us to look at verses 12 through 20 and notice this vision that John sees that will be connected to each of these seven letters. And I'll show you how that works as we talk about this. But let me just point out before we read verses 12 through 20, that in the book of Revelation, there are three visions of Jesus. The first one comes right before the seven letters, and that's the one we're about to read. The second vision of Jesus is in Revelation 4 and 5, right after the seven letters. So the seven letters are bookended by a vision of Jesus. And then the final vision of Jesus in the book of Revelation is in chapter 19, verses 11 through 21, when he's conquering on a horse. And he's got the sword, and he's going to execute vengeance and justice on all of those who have persecuted God's people. So as we're looking at this text, we're looking at the first vision of Jesus in the book of Revelation. Let's go ahead and read Revelation chapter 1, verses 12 through 20. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me. And on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, Fear not, I am the first and the last and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. Write therefore the things that you have seen, those that are to take place after the sorry, let me start in verse 19 again. Write therefore the things that you have seen, those things that are, and those things that are to take place after this. As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. Now I want you to imagine this scene. Here's John, and he heard this voice speaking to him like a trumpet, but in this vision, his back was turned to whoever was speaking to him initially. And then he turns, and then he sees this image that is described only in terms of what it's like. Did you notice that as I was reading the text? The first time that you see the word like is John turns around and he sees that it was someone who was like the Son of Man. Perhaps an allusion to Daniel chapter 7 about this Son of Man that was going to come and subdue all of these beasts that came from the sea, which represented the nations. But after he says this one that was like the Son of Man, he uses the word like 6 more times. What's the significance of that? You notice that when John sees a vision of Jesus, this is a glorious vision. But this vision is only what Jesus is like. Because if you was to see Jesus in all of his glory, what would happen to him? You can't look at the sun and keep your eyesight. And you can't look at God in all of his glory and live. And so what God has to do is he has to condescend to us and speak to us and communicate and show himself in ways that wouldn't kill us. So he keeps saying it was like this, it was like that, it was like this, and even what it's like is amazing. Now, I know that there's liabilities in showing a picture like this because these pictures can look cheesy and whatever, but this is the best picture that I could find of what John saw. So I want you to imagine this. John heard this thunderous voice that was like a trumpet. He turns around, and this is what he sees. He sees this one like the Son of Man, and he's wearing a robe and golden sash. Well, kings wear robes. Maybe it's emphasizing that he's the king. But who wore sashes in the Old Testament? The priests did. So maybe this golden sash around him is emphasizing Jesus's intercessory work that he does for the 7 churches. As he looks up, he sees his white hair and his white head. The idea of this being that Jesus possesses perfect wisdom, and it's pure wisdom. His eyes on this picture make him look like he's albino, but his eyes are flames of fire, and I imagine that he's not even blinking. But this is emphasizing that he sees everything. Remember how each church begins by saying, I know your works, I know everything about you guys. His feet. Did you notice what were said about his feet? They were like burnished bronze. You know, as John is trying to take in this vision, what is the meaning of burnished bronze feet? You know, in like the book of Joshua, the book of conquest, and there's archaeological writings in caves or whatever, or tablets that show these things being depicted. But what a king would do in the ancient world is if they've subjugated their enemies, they would put their feet on the necks of those that they had subjugated. For Jesus to have burnished bronze feet is this idea that his judgments and his abilities to subjugate his enemies is rock solid and perfect. Jesus's voice is like the voice of many waters. Have you ever been to Niagara Falls? I went to Niagara Falls when I was 10 years old in 1999. And I still remember how deafening the sound of the waters were. Even if you take a shower and somebody in the same room as you is trying to talk to you, sometimes it's hard to hear just from the water from the shower. But his voice is so deafening that it just drowns out everything else. And that's what it ought to be in our life, that his voice just drowns out all the other voices, and that's the one that we listen to. As John looks more and more closely, he sees that Jesus' right hand is held out. And he's holding these 7 stars that represent the 7 angels that are going to be sent to the churches. Does that mean every church has an angel? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's just talking about the messenger that would bring these letters to the 7 churches. And from his mouth comes this sword with which Jesus is going to wage war against some of these churches that are tolerating false teaching. And his face is shining like the sun. Now, if you were to see an image like this, what would you do? Would you see a vision like this and say, Jesus is my homeboy? Like I've seen people wear t-shirts like that. Or would you say, what's up, dude? Notice what John does in the face of Jesus's glory is he falls down as if he's dead. And then when he falls down as if he's dead, the same glorious right hand that can hold 7 stars reaches down and comforts John. Don't miss that the glory of Jesus in this scene is amazing, but it doesn't take away from his comfort. Those two things can coexist. And John is then told to write the things that we have in the book of Revelation. All right, so this is the vision that John sees. What are some lessons we can learn from this vision that help prepare us for these 7 churches that we'll begin looking at? Maybe the first thing to consider is the purpose of the lampstand. Every church was represented by a lampstand. And the purpose of a lampstand is to illuminate a room. These are familiar pictures that we have in other places in the Bible. Matthew chapter 5, verses 14 through 16, where Jesus says, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Or another similar passage, but it doesn't use the same imagery. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15. If I delay, here's Paul writing to Timothy. He says, if I delay in coming to you, he's writing this letter so that you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. What's the purpose of a local church? A pillar and buttress of the truth. What is a pillar supposed to do? Well, a pillar holds something up. And the point of the pillar is not to bring attention to itself. The point of the pillar is to hold something up so that people can see the thing that's being held up. And so here you've got this imagery, and the same imagery is used of this lampstand here. What's the purpose of the Rockdale Church of Christ? To be a lamp. It's to help cultivate people that are going to be shining as lights in a dark world. The purpose of this local church is to uphold the truth first and foremost above everything else. Now, in the book of Revelation, if this is the mission of these 7 churches, there are barriers in the book of Revelation that would prevent people from living out this mission. What are those barriers? In Revelation, and we'll come back to these things throughout this series, but in the book of Revelation, there are 3 primary enemies, and I've wanted to make this into a sermon, this little point that I'm about to make. I've wanted to just do this as a sermon someday. But there's 3 enemies in the book of Revelation that could potentially cause these 7 churches to not fulfill their mission of being lights. The first one is persecution. Revelation 13 talks about this sea beast that comes out of the sea, because it's a sea beast. It reminds you of Godzilla or something. And it represents, I think, the Roman persecution against the Christians. That when the government starts saying that you can't practice Christianity, how many people are going to remain faithful? That's one of the dangers that the Roman Empire posed for them. The second danger is false worship. In Revelation 13, you also have this earth beast that works in connection with the government, and it's telling people to worship the government. So you've got this idea of this false worship. I've talked to a lot of people recently that have gotten so much into things, even like conspiracy theories, that they've been so dedicated to them like you would be, like it was a religion. But false religion today causes many people to be lost. The third temptation is worldliness. And this worldliness is described as this harlot in Revelation 17 and 18. The idea being that if you sleep with the harlot, this is the imagery that Revelation 17 and 18 uses, that if you sleep with this harlot, she'll give you all kinds of blessings. Now, what that metaphor, that imagery means for the 7 churches is that if you just go along with the cultural beliefs of the day and you go along with the emperor cult worship and you do all the things that your society wants you to do, you can have economic benefits for doing it. Does anybody feel that pressure today? You stand up as a Christian in your workplace? Are there more chances today than, I don't know how many years ago, you might lose your job? Is cancel culture a real thing? Where if you try to stand up and talk to people about the Lord, you have more dangers economically. And if you just don't talk, then you'll have more of these physical blessings that the country can give you. These are some of the temptations that these 7 churches were facing. And the expectation in the book of Revelation is that you remain so committed to your mission that you'd be willing to die for it. Revelation 12, verse 11. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. One of the challenges that we're going to have as we look at these 2 chapters in Revelation is to ask ourselves, am I so committed to the reasons Jesus has saved me that I would die for it? That's the mission, though. That's the imagery of the lampstand in this vision. Notice the second lesson, though, is that Jesus is the answer to those barriers. Now, why do I say that? And how do we get that from this vision? This looks forward to some of the future lessons, but there's something about the descriptions of Jesus that get brought up in every one of the 7 letters. Here's a chart that shows this. When John writes this letter to the church at Ephesus, it introduces Jesus as the one holding the 7 stars, and he's in the midst of the lampstands. We see that in Revelation 2:1. The church at Smyrna, it pictures Jesus in Revelation 2:8 as the first and the last, the one that died and lives forever. These are all different ideas from this vision that we just looked at. The point to make from this is that for all the churches, all these 7 churches, what was it that they needed? They all needed Jesus. Now, they all needed some different aspect of Jesus. So, for example, Pergamum, that was tolerating false teaching, they needed to know what was coming out of Jesus's mouth, and that was a sword that was going to wage war, the sword of the Spirit, the Word of God. That part of Jesus needed to be emphasized, but you see here that with all of these churches, there's some aspect of Jesus that they need to know. I remember when I first started preaching at the church in California, I was a 25-year-old young punk guy. Now I'm a 31-year-old, less of a punk, I think. But I remember when I was having the responsibilities of preaching every Sunday night, every Sunday morning, teaching every Wednesday night, teaching every Sunday morning Bible class. And I wondered, how in the world am I going to have the wisdom to know what I should be teaching to these people that I don't even know yet? And my plan going into that situation was to just teach the Bible. I was just going to teach the Bible. I was going to try to talk about Jesus and what he's done for us. I was going to try to talk about every angle of Jesus. What if the only vision that John had was just a vision of Jesus's love? Would that help the church at Pergamum too much that was tolerating false teaching? You see, there's some people that want to emphasize one part of Jesus to the neglect of another part. You need the whole thing, and the whole thing is going to affect you in different ways depending on the circumstances of your life. So for John, this vision gets brought in and looped into every one of the churches. Do you know what it is that every one of us need? We don't need that psychologist versus that. We don't need this thing versus that. What all of us need is Jesus, and Jesus can't be reduced. But there's something about Jesus that will help every one of us, no matter what circumstance we're in. And so that's why I think this begins and ends with this kind of vision here. All right, so Jesus is the answer to all of these problems that they're facing. The final thing that I want us to consider is how we should respond to a vision like this. What was it that John did when he responded to this vision of Jesus? The first thing is that he fell down before him. G. Campbell Morgan was a preacher in the 1800s and early 1900s. And G. Campbell Morgan said, about this vision. He said, take this picture and look at it again and again until the vision holds you in its marvelous power. When you are not obligated to think about anything, when you're just like going to bed at night or you're just sitting around and you don't have any obligations, what does your mind most naturally drift towards? Does it ever drift towards how glorious and great Jesus is, and who he is, and these different aspects that we've seen of him even in this vision? If we're not falling down before him, like metaphorically in our hearts, if we don't see how great he is, then the problem is our spiritual eyesight. But just as John fell down before the glory of Jesus, what's the expectation of every one of these 7 churches and the problems that they face? The way that they're going to overcome these things is, first of all, by falling down before him. And then secondly, receive comfort. Remember when Jesus would say something like in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted? Here's John, and he falls down, knowing that he's totally unworthy of being before this Jesus, and this same Jesus comforts him. The way up is to go down first. Why does that matter? Again, everything that's happening to John right here is paralleling what the churches need to understand. The churches need to see his glory, just like John did. The churches need to find comfort from Jesus, not from other things that they could find comfort from. And then thirdly, when John received comfort from Jesus, he was told, write the things that you have seen. Did he obey that? He obeyed it because we have the book of Revelation. Do you know what the key is to learning obedience? Is to see how amazing Jesus is, to allow him to comfort you, allow him to be the one to forgive you, allow him to be the one that gives you hope, not anything else in this life. You find comfort from him, and then that provides the proper motivation to do everything he's asked you to do. John is amazed, he's comforted, and then he obeys. What needs to happen for every one of these churches? What needs to happen to every church today is we need to recapture how amazing Jesus is in our hearts. We need to understand that even though he's far above us, he's still going to bring us comfort. And that is going to be the thing that motivates us to obey him, even to the point of death. You see how what John experienced here needs to become the same experience for all of the 7 churches. And this gets us ready, I believe, to help us start looking at each one of these churches. So again, Lord willing, next month we'll begin looking at the church at Ephesus, and we'll just move from one church to another. And if there's any months that you guys need me to come more than one time, we can look at more of one of them in one month. But I'm looking forward to looking at this series together. I hope this will be encouraging and helpful for us. This is an opportunity right now, though, if there's anybody that has any needs, if anybody needs the prayers of the congregation, if anybody feels like they've been missing their purpose as a Christian, you can get help. We're about to sing, was it 671? 670. Oh, 616. Okay. Okay, wrong one. Okay. We're gonna sing the song number 616. If there's anybody that has any needs, I know a lot of you are listening online. Please text or call somebody from this church, have a meaningful conversation, or if there's anybody here that needs to come forward, you can do so while we stand and while we sing.